This is a general introduction to the network setup and port forwarding of ACTi devices, both Windows and Linux NVRs such as the INR, GNR, and ENR, along with ACTi cameras. Port forwarding is when you need to connect to your devices from a network different than the one that the devices are on. Port forwarding is set up in the router. But before we talk about port forwarding, let's review the network setup for ACTi devices. First, we will talk about the Linux system, starting with the ENR. There are two ways to set up the ENR system. One is through the HDMI local monitor, and one is through the Internet Explorer on a PC. Because this is a tutorial, I'm not going to be able to show you what the local monitor looks like, but you can always see the interface and the step-by-step instructions through our administrator manual. To download our manuals, just go to the ACTi website, www.acti.com. If you click on Downloads at the very top, you'll come here into the Download Center. Under Global Search, just type in your ENR model and tell it that you're looking for VMS manuals under Manuals and Guides, and you'll see the user and the administrator manuals for the different models that you need. So if you look in the administrator manual, it will take you step by step through the local monitor's interface and how to set it up. If you look at the quick installation guide that comes with your ENRs, which are also downloadable through the Download Center, you will see the recommended setup for the ACTi ENRs. You can see that by default, LAN 1 is always 192.168.0.10, and you'll see that LAN 2 is always, by default, DHCP. In addition, the DHCP server on LAN 1 of the ENR is always on. Therefore, we recommend that LAN 1 goes to your PoE switch to all of your cameras, and LAN 2 goes back to the network. So after you have this kind of setup, you can plug your laptop into the switch and turn the Wi-Fi on so that you are able to configure your cameras and also connect back to the internet for setup purposes. I currently have my ENR set up with this kind of structure. Therefore, I can come into my laptop, and if need be, I can open up my IP utility, and you will see that at the top of the IP utility, these are the different networks that my computer is currently connected to. This is my Wi-Fi, and this is my Ethernet connection. So if I search on my Ethernet connection, which is connected back to my switch to the LAN 1 of the ENR, you will see that my ENR automatically comes up. The IP utility is designed to find all ACTi cameras regardless of whether or not they are on the same IP address range as your computer. However, for Linux systems, you must be in the same range in order for the IP utility to be able to find your ENR. If you need to change the IP address of your computer, you go into your Start menu, go to Control Panel, go to Network and Internet, go to Network and Sharing Center, click on Change Adapter Settings, find your local Ethernet connection, right-click and click on Properties. Go to IPv4, and this is where you can set it up to use a static IP address or DHCP. Currently, I am allowing the DHCP server that is automatically on LAN 1 of the ENR to assign my computer an IP address. The Linux systems are designed to use Internet Explorer. So if you click on the IP address here, it will automatically log you into your ENR. It will find the correct IP address and the correct port. The IP utility uses the default username and password admin12346 in order to log into the devices that you have listed. As such, I automatically log into my ENR. I can also get to my ENR if I know the port of my ENR by opening up my Internet Explorer and typing in the IP address. You can do your basic setups at the very beginning. Don't forget to change your time zones, along with syncing to an NTP server should you wish to do so. And the rest of the configurations can be done either through this basic setup or on other settings on the setup page. This is our live view page. If I go into my setup, you can see that this is my LAN 1 and my LAN 2 for this particular ENR. Remember, according to the setup as shown in the quick installation guide, LAN 2 goes back to the customer's network, which already has an IP address range. LAN 1 you can either leave as the default 192.168.0 or you can change it to something else. Because we've set it up according to the quick installation guide, my LAN 1 is going to my cameras and LAN 2 is going back to my router network. You only need a gateway on the network that is going back to the router. Therefore, we can get rid of this gateway here. To edit, you go into your network connection and you can go ahead and just get rid of the gateway that was written in there and hit save. You always want to make sure that LAN 1 and LAN 2 are in completely different subnets. So for example, if your router network gives you 192.168.1, you want to make sure your LAN 1 is at least 192.168 some other number. So here we have 192.168.0 and 192.168.1. After you're done setting things up, you want your LAN 2 to be a manual static IP address. Otherwise, whenever your router decides to change IP addresses, your LAN 2 address is going to change, which means it's going to be difficult to link back to your ENR. So basically what you want to do is you want to copy down the information here, your IP address, your subnet, and your gateway, and then go into network connection, change LAN 2 over to manual, and go ahead and change the settings. For your DNS settings, if one was not given to you by the customer, you can go ahead and use Google's, which would be 8.8.8.8. Secondary will be 8.8.4.4, and go ahead and hit save. Now, both LAN 1 and LAN 2 are static and manual IP addresses. You always want to make sure your default gateway is whatever LAN is going back to your router network. For us, here it's LAN 2. If you ever want to turn off the DHCP server for your LAN 1, you can always come into here and disable it. To find the HTTP port of your ENR, you come into here into port mapping. By default, all ACTi devices use default HTTP port 80. However, for your NVRs, we don't recommend that you use port 80 as it is a very common port and is also very commonly blocked. So this section is where you would change your HTTP port. Change it from the default HTTP port. Now let's talk about the network setup for the Windows systems, such as the INR or the GNR. The GNR and the INR as well have a LAN 1 and a LAN 2, just like the ENR. However, unlike the ENR, the Windows systems do not come with their own DHCP server, so it doesn't matter whether you attach LAN 2 to the router or LAN 1. Because it's a Windows system, when you boot up your Windows system, you're going to see the same Windows interface as on your PC. In order to set up the network, you come into your Start menu, Control Panel, Network and Internet, Network and Sharing Center, change adapter settings. You'll see the LAN 1 and the LAN 2 of your Windows systems. Here, LAN 1 goes to the router network and LAN 2 goes to the cameras. So in order to change the network address, you just right-click, click on Properties, double-click on IPv4, and you can go ahead and assign your Windows system a static IP address. Here, our camera network is on 172.16.200. Because this is the camera network, no gateway is necessary. LAN 2, in the beginning, when you click on Properties, IPv4, you want this to be on a DHCP address. When it is, you can come into the Start menu and open up your command prompt. You type in ipconfig, and it will tell you the address that it is currently receiving from the router. You want to copy down this address, go back into your LAN connection that goes back to your router network, click on Properties, IPv4, and change it to a static IP address of exactly the same thing that you saw in your command prompt. For your DNS server, if there is not one previously provided to you by your customer, you can go ahead and use Google's, which is 8.8.8.8, and it will be 8.8.4.4. You want both LANs to be static IP addresses so that the LAN that goes back to the router network won't change whenever the router decides to change IP addresses, and then you want your camera network to be static so that it will be able to communicate with your cameras. To find the port of your Windows system, come into your Start menu and search for the NVR3 Administrator tool. Open it up, and you'll see in the bottom right corner of your computer, in your icons box, if you open it up, you'll be able to see the NVR3 Administrator tool icon. If you double click, the dialog box will open up and you'll be able to find the port of your NVR and change it if necessary. By default, all HTTP ports of ACTi devices, both cameras and NVRs, is always HTTP port 80. However, we don't recommend using port 80 as it is a commonly used and commonly blocked port. If on your Windows systems, such as your GNR or your INR, you are ever unable to connect from a workstation client PC on the same local network as the server, what you want to do is to check the firewall. So on your actual server, you come into the Start menu, search for the word firewall, click on Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, click on Inbound Rules on the left, click on New Rule on the right, tell it that you want to open up a rule for a port, hit Next. TCP is fine, go ahead and tell the specific port that you have, for example 9888, hit Next, basically all the way through until it asks you to name it, and hit Finish, and then try again. To set static IP addresses for your cameras, you can either do it through the IP utility by checking off the camera on the left, click on Change Network Address, click on Static IP Address, and changing this example IP address to whatever static IP address you would like the camera to have. If you checked off multiple cameras, you can assign multiple static IP addresses at once. So for example, if I were to start from 0100 and had checked off multiple cameras, it would go from 0100 to 0101, 0102 until it was completed. You can also change the IP address by logging into the camera, going into the setup, clicking on the IP settings, connection type, and changing it to static. Again, these are just filler numbers and you can change it to whatever you'd like. After you hit apply, it will ask you to save and reboot, whereby then you can just come into the system and click on save and reboot. The ports of the camera are found under Network, Port Mapping. When you port forward a camera, you will need to port forward the HTTP port, the control server port, and the streaming server port, which by default are 80, 6001, and 6002. Now let's talk about the actual port forwarding. Assuming that your laptop is connected to the router network, you can find the IP address of your router by coming into your Start menu, opening up your command prompt, and typing ipconfig. And you'll see that the default gateway it gives you is 192.168.1.1. So you open up your Internet Explorer, type in that address. For our demo purposes, we'll go ahead and show you the Linksys router. However, every router's port forwarding settings will look a little bit different, so this is just an example. Common terms that you might find referring to port forwarding in the different routers is pinhole, NAT, virtual server, gaming applications, port forwarding. For this router, it's under security, apps and gaming, and you'll see that there's things such as single port forwarding, port range, and port triggering. If your ports are all in a range, you can go ahead and use port forwarding, and you can always do single port forwarding as well. So we go ahead and add a single port. Basically, our application can be called the ENR. We know that the HTTP port is 9888 for our ENR. So the internal and external port will both be that HTTP port. The protocol you can leave as such, and the device IP address on LAN 2 was 1.101. Again, this is on LAN 2 of the ENR, and that the HTTP port was 9888 for us. Afterwards, you can go ahead and hit save. So if it was for our Windows systems, our HTTP port was 1010, and our IP address. So for the Linux and the Windows NVRs, you only ever have to port forward the HTTP ports. For the cameras, you need to port forward 3 ports of the HTTP port, the control server port, and the streaming server port. So for our camera, it was port 80 and 80 back to its static IP address of whatever you chose. You also need to do 6001 and hit save, and then you also need to do 6002. If you ever try to log into your camera remotely and all you can see is a blue screen, it's possible that someone only port forwarded the HTTP port. So what you can do is you can come into the router, go into the port range, and if we still use the default ports of the camera, then they forgot to port forward the streaming and the server port. So you can do a port range of 6001 to 6002, the default ports of the camera, or whichever range you picked for those 2 ports, and then the static IP address of your camera, and hit save. This has been a general overview of the network setup and port forwarding of the Linux and Windows systems along with ACTi cameras.